Hi Founder fans, Jason here, and today we're going to be talking about Benedict Arnold's trek through the Maine Wilderness, his expedition. Now, I know when you hear the name Benedict Arnold, your first thought is, treason, traitor, boo. And yes, in hindsight you're correct. But in 1775 that was far from the case. Benedict Arnold was a merchant from Connecticut who, when news of Lexington and Concord happened, gathered together men and marched to the siege of Boston. And he at this point was making a case for himself to be given command of men. He had been heavily involved in the taking of Fort Ticonderoga, although he and Ethan Allen stepped on each other's toes a lot in that particular scenario. And then Arnold went back to the Continental Army in just outside of Boston and told Washington, hey, Georgie, why don't we invade Canada? And then word got back to Continental Congress, and everyone was like, yeah, okay, that's actually a really good idea. Thanks, Ben. And Arnold was like, can I lead it? And they were like, no. No, General Schuyler, Philip Schuyler of New York, was in charge of the Northern Department. Now, Arnold said, well, how can I get involved? And then he said, well, hey guys, what if while they go up through the Hudson and the St. Lawrence into Canada, what if I go up through Maine? And they said, okay. And he was given a colonel's commission. And he was allowed to collect men to go up through Maine. And as these gentlemen had been growing tired of the siege of Boston, which basically meant sitting in a garrison outside of Boston and not getting much done, a lot of people signed up. And he recruited a group. There were three forces, one over Lieutenant Colonel Enos, one under Lieutenant Christopher Green, who years later would have one of the first racially integrated units in the Continental Army from Rhode Island, and Daniel Morgan, whose name might sound familiar to many of you. And Morgan was specifically brought in because he had Virginians and Pennsylvanians under his command that he had brought all the way on foot to Boston, and these particular units were more accustomed to training and fighting and moving through a frontier wilderness, which was the goal to go through Maine. They were going to go up the coast of New England and cut straight across Maine and meet the main body of the Northern Department in Quebec. So Arnold starts moving, and he thinks it's going to take about 20 days to move this 180 miles. Now, unfortunately, he was given misinformation. Specifically, the maps he received were wrong. There were a lot of inaccuracies, and it turns out that this 20-day march actually took almost 50 days. Went from September 11th till the end of October, during which time they traversed really rugged terrain, and the temperature dropped and dipped below zero because it gets cold early in the northernmost parts of the United States. Take it from me, outside of Syracuse. So Arnold's moving up the coast and he's cutting through the brush, but some of Morgan's guys are better at moving and they get ahead, and then Green and Enos are caught behind. Actually, Enos ends up leaving because the soldiers run out of food. They only had provisions for 20 days, and they had almost doubled that time, to the point where Henry Dearborn, who would later go on to be Secretary of War for all 8 years of Thomas Jefferson's presidency, he's on this trip, and he brought a dog with him, and that dog didn't make it. The men cut it up and ate it, and then saved the bones to be ground down to make a broth later. Because that's the type of scenario these men found themselves in. No one was prepared for what happened. Now, men did get sick and left behind, but a surprisingly large amount of these soldiers actually made it through to Quebec. And they're on the Plains of Abraham, they're outside of Quebec, and they realize, oh, we are weak and hungry and tired, and vastly outnumbered, and that city of Quebec was garrisoned. It was a fortress, more or less. And they're like, there's no way we're going to get in. So, fortunately, General Richard Montgomery had just taken Montreal. Yes, we invaded Montreal during the American Revolution successfully. And what Arnold decided to do was wait for Montgomery to get there with the Northern Department and work together for the invasion. And that's what they did. Unfortunately, they would kick in the doors and storm in, and Montgomery would take a bullet to the head immediately, and Arnold would get shot, I believe, in the leg in Quebec. I think it was the left leg. I'm not 100% positive on that. He did, though, get shot right away and carried out, despite his demands to be left there. And from there, the invasion of Canada fell apart. But it had very little to do with Arnold himself. In fact, Arnold was praised at the time for undertaking this tremendous achievement of crossing Maine in such a... It was twice as long as he thought it would take, but it was a very short amount of time for cutting through what was then uninhabited wilderness. You know, there were even very few Native Americans lived there. It was cold and wooded, treacherous, swampy. But that is the beginning of Benedict Arnold making a name for himself as a hero. And he was, and no one likes hearing me say this, but Benedict Arnold was most certainly a hero of the American Revolution until a certain treason. Which is what made the treason all that more spectacular. It's why it is the great treason of American history, is because all of Arnold's success. So I'm going to leave it there for now. If you like this, please hit like. If you just stumble on this video, please hit subscribe. If you have any questions or comments, leave them in the blah, blah, blah below. And I will see you tomorrow.